This is an interview with Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, and we're going to be talking about issues related to criminal justice. Now, I read your book, The Condemnation of Blackness, and they discussed a lot of things, but in particular, you know that racism has been something that's been happening, but when you hear about the way people are thinking about black people, I find that to be extraordinarily challenging to even accept. But can you talk a little bit about what they refer to as the Negro problem that occurred after slavery and how that's related to the present day criminal justice system?
Sure. Well, thank you for this. So the Negro problem is a term that emerges within a decade after the Civil War concludes. So we're talking about the 1870s. And the problem was a demographic one, as social scientists and demographers defined it. Essentially said that the black birth rate was greater than the white birth rate. And if this were to continue, black people would take over the country. That they would have a superior population. And this created a lot of anxiety among elites and leaders in the United States at the time. Interestingly, the mortality rate, however, for black people was greater than the birth rate. So black people were dying at faster rates. And there's an 1890 census, which is a census that it comes out 25 years after the end of slavery. It's a really important milestone in the nation's history because it's the first time that, that a black population generationally had not been born into slavery. And it was a real litmus test, according to white supremacists and white leaders, to see kind of what were black people made of. And one of the things that they latched onto was this notion that black people, due to their biological inferiority, were dying at greater rates of, say, tuberculosis and contagious diseases. They also latched onto this idea that because black people had higher crime rates, that they would kill each other. And as a consequence of this, there was no need to worry that white people would be okay. It really became a dominant social scientific concept and idea. Became baked into the American Academy. It drove scholarship in all sorts of directions, from what kind of education should black people receive, what kind of jobs should they have, what kind of health care should they have access to, and most certainly helped to underwrite the notion that black people were a dangerous criminal class. So this Negro problem actually became simplified into a criminal problem. And that served many purposes. One, it served to control black people's freedom. If you could define black people as a dangerous criminal race, then you could justify discrimination in policing, you could justify discrimination in punishment, you could justify mob violence and lynching. You could justify just about anything in the name of security, national security, local security, law and order. And that template or blueprint that begins in the late 19th century is still with us today.
Wow, that is powerful information to have.
Yeah.
So it is still with us, and so just for those who may not be familiar with what are the problems with the criminal justice system with regard to black people, can you just speak briefly about
Sure.
that?
So I think of this in three phases. So the first phase that we could define is that in the immediate aftermath of slavery, as I just described, this Negro problem takes on a kind of project of criminalizing black people. That's when I describe a dangerous criminal class. Mm-hmm. That gave permission for the restriction of freedom for black people. The second phase is called mass criminalization, which is to say that you could develop public policies that said, oh, because they're criminals, they don't really need schools. They need reformatories. They don't really need jobs. They need coercive labor arrangements, whether it's in a prison context or proximate to it, like convict leasing. And then the third phase is mass incarceration. Now, the interesting thing about mass incarceration is that it does not occur until the 1970s. After the first two phases are about labor extraction. How do we use the criminal justice system to restrict Black people's freedom and put them to work? But by the 1970s, because of deindustrialization and the outsourcing of jobs outside of places where Black people traditionally lived, Black labor became less necessary. People call it redundant. And as a consequence of that redundancy, we saw a greater investment in putting more and more Black people into prison. Mass criminalization only gave way to mass incarceration at a time when the idea was no longer how many Black people can we force into unfree labor, but instead behind a prison wall or in cages.
Wow. So that brings to mind the school to prison pipeline and the 13th Amendment, where they talk about involuntary servitude only being available or legal if the person has been imprisoned. So what do you think needs to be done to correct this situation, to undo all of this mis and disinformation?
Yeah.
You know.
So let's think about and answer that question. First of all, I just want to acknowledge what a great reminder about the 13th Amendment as a constitutional basis for mass criminalization and mass incarceration. And just so that everyone is clear, the 13th Amendment has a slavery loophole. It essentially says that involuntary servitude can exist with the conviction or punishment for a crime. And there are a number of states in this country, a few that have passed constitutional amendments to their state laws to restrict any form of slavery in the present. California recently in the 2024 election had a ballot measure that proposed the same, and voters rejected it, which is just remarkable.
Do you know about New Jersey?
I don't think Jersey has proposed striking it, but I can't be certain. But something to think about.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so you asked about remedies. So the first thing we need to think about is in three buckets. The first would be culture. How do we change the culture of punitiveness? The United States is an outlier in the world. It has about 5% of the world's population and anywhere from 20 to 25% of the incarcerated population. For a country that prides itself on the notion of the land of the free and the home of the brave, is the most unfree place on planet Earth when it comes to the number of people who are behind cages. So we have to think about culture, the culture of punitiveness. The second bucket is a policy bucket, which is to say, what are the policies that would need to change in order to reverse mass incarceration and mass criminalization? And then the third bucket is a political one. What would be necessary for our politics to align in order to make those policy choices happen? So let's break it down. The cultural one is one that has a lot to do with our public narratives. How do we talk about people? How do we talk about punishment? How do we teach and educate people about the nature of human beings? Are we a country that believes in second chances, as George Bush famously said when he was president? Are we a country that is interested in how Europeans engage in punishment, which is to say that they take a parsimonious approach? The least amount of punishment in order to restore an individual to their place in society as quickly as possible. Quick example. In many parts of Europe, people who are convicted, say, of murder can be expected to be released back into the population within 2.5 years. And the reason being is because the conditions and the purpose of punishment is restoration and what they call resocialization. How do we attend to the particular needs of an individual who has done a great harm to an individual and society to restore them back to their own humanity and let them return to society? In this country, we do pretty much just the opposite. When you go to prison, we pretty much do everything in our power to dehumanize you, to treat you like an animal, to tell you you're worthless, and to root against you. There are volumes of evidence that prisons actually encourage people to return as soon as possible. Prisoners, I'll see you when you come back. It's just the opposite in Europe. So the last thing I'll say about culture is there is tremendous bloodlust in the general population. People want vengeance. someone does something, whether it's an accident, whether it's intentional, whatever the case, people believe that by destroying human beings who have committed crimes, they will be safer, when that's not the truth. Most people don't commit murder. Violence is only about 5% of the crimes committed in this country. That means 95% fall well short of having committed a violent homicidal act. But we have built a system that focuses on the 5%. Let's talk about the policy levers. The policy levers are pretty straightforward. We built a system based on putting as many people away for as long as possible. If you want to have a smaller prison population, you have to adjust your sentencing to a combination of a kind of stick, which is the loss of liberty within conditions that actually work with individuals so they can be better, and carrots, which are incentives to job training, to jobs, to social investments in their community, so that the underlying issues, which are largely poverty, are addressed before people choose to break the law. And we could talk about many specifics, but that would include changing the nature of policing, where police officers often get to be judge, jury, and executioner, in which case that's a problem because that's part of the punitive ethos. And then the last thing I'll say is the political problem. We saw over the past 10 to 15 years great strides towards changing our politics, creating greater awareness for the need for a change in the policies of mass incarceration to acknowledge systemic racism. And yet, now we are at a time where there is no political momentum in that direction. So somehow those three things have to work together in order to reverse what is now 150 years of building the most punitive racist system the world has ever known. It's not an impossible task, but it does require tremendous commitment, sustaining that commitment, and a populist movement to do so.
It's interesting that when you mentioned the concept of keeping people in prison for as long as possible, because I think it makes me think of another, like Eisenhower warned of the military industrial complex, but I think there's a prison industrial complex where these businesses also make a lot of money.
Sure.
When people are in prison.
And that's, quickly I'll just say that yes, except that about 90% of prisons are run on public dollars. So privatization has a stake in it, and most of the people who are in private prisons are actually immigrants detained by the federal government.
Yeah.
Mostly we are profiting as public taxpayers by either exploiting people by making them work for pennies on a dollar for the state itself, or creating jobs in our policing and correction systems, because those are protected jobs for people who are invested in a system that is punitive and racist.
Thank you for clarifying that. So my next question is, as you explained, it's a challenge to really get those pieces together in order to address this issue. But in our current situation, I'm sure there are things I'm sure you must see that really would block our ability to make those changes. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I think we are experiencing in the United States right now with this election of Donald Trump, the second election of Donald Trump, and a Congress that has given him a free license to feed his most authoritarian tendencies and to break most of the norms and many of the constitutional laws, including the separation of powers in this country. We are moving into uncharted territory, certainly for anyone watching this conversation's lifetime. The closest thing that we'd have to come back to would really be the context of the Civil War. And by that I mean that the desire to literally break the nation apart in pursuit of a vision that restores white men to positions of power presumptively as the natural-born leaders of this country is the fuel that has catalyzed the MAGA movement of Republicans. We should all remember and not forget that Donald Trump came into power on the basis of a big lie that Barack Obama had not been born in the United States and was therefore an illegitimate president. And so that quote-unquote birther movement was predicated on the notion that a man of color born to an African immigrant and a white woman from Kansas had no business being the president of the United States. Additionally, as Donald Trump, the head of a birther movement, coalesced with a resurgent white supremacist movement that's always been with us, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has been around since the 1970s, a watchdog group that keeps track of hate and militia populations. That movement gained much more legitimacy and credibility in the wake of Donald Trump's attacks on Barack Obama. As a consequence of that, we saw a new movement around something called the Great Replacement Theory. And the Great Replacement Theory argues essentially that the demographics of the United States will eventually lead to a country that is no longer a majority white population. The best way to forestall the Great Replacement Theory is to close the borders to non-Europeans, to limit the political power of Jews and people of color, and to control the reproductive rights of women, and more particularly white women, to restrict their access to abortion in order to increase their birth rates. We've seen every version of the ideology behind those movements I just described, from the birther movement to the Great Replacement Theory movement, including controlling the reproductive rights of white women, materialize in policy formation under Donald Trump in this recent election. So when I say we are in uncharted territory that looks much more like the Civil War, I'm describing conditions where people are willing to destroy, to wage war on the country in order to uphold a vision of America that centers white supremacist maleness as the people who are most responsible for controlling the fate of this nation.
That is, I think, right on point. And add to that, putting the African American or people of color, that population behind bars where they don't, they're unable to do any resistance, taking away the rights of people who receive federal assistance, also making them, focusing on survival rather than paying attention to what's going on. I think that is so on point. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you. And thank you for doing what you're doing to help educate others.
Thank you.